They said she was sent to study the rocks, and in a place like this, a place of nothing but rocks and wind, that was a kind of madness. The woman, Eris, was a ghost before she ever earned the name. A quiet shape moving along the perimeter of forward operating base vigilance, her eyes not on the jagged horizon where threats lived, but on the ground at her feet. She carried a geologist's hammer, not a rifle. She wore sterile civilian khakis, not camouflage. To the hardened operators and exhausted soldiers garrisoned in that God-forsaken valley, she was an anomaly, a piece of useless academic baggage sent by some out-of-touch command that understood spreadsheets better than it understood war. The valley itself was a tactical nightmare, a geological anomaly the old maps called the Dragon's Maw. It was a deep, narrow canyon carved into a granite massif that bled iron, staining the cliffs a permanent, angry red. The rock formations were sharp, crystalline, and they played hell with sensors. Radio waves didn't so much bounce as they were devoured, shredded by the mineral content and the bizarre, resonant frequencies of the stone. Silence here was not an absence of sound, but a presence, a heavy, listening thing that seemed to press in from all sides. The wind was the only constant, a mournful, keening thing that scoured the landscape, and the soul with equal abrasive force. It carried whispers that sounded like voices and sand that felt like glass. Aris understood this place. She understood it in a way the soldiers, with their threat assessments and fields of fire, never could. She saw the story written in the strata of the canyon walls, the tale of seismic upheaval and violent volcanism. She felt the subtle hum of the earth beneath her boots, a low-frequency vibration born from the immense pressure of the tectonic plates grinding below. She cataloged the crystalline structures in the granite, noting their piezoelectric potential. She measured the way the sun heated the dark, iron-rich southern face of the canyon versus the shaded northern wall, creating a permanent thermal differential that drove the valley's treacherous and unpredictable air currents. To everyone else, it was just rock. To her, it was a weapon. It was an equation waiting to be solved. Her days were a quiet ritual. She would walk the wire, collecting samples. She would return to her small, Spartan corner of the command tent, a space she had claimed that was little more than a cot and a table cluttered with rock chips, a portable mass spectrometer, and a ruggedized laptop. The soldiers watched her with a mixture of pity and contempt. They saw a woman lost in a world of pebbles while they were engaged in the deadly, serious business of survival. They didn't see the complex atmospheric models she was building, the acoustic propagation charts, or the detailed geological surveys she overlaid with enemy signal intercept data. They didn't see the pattern she was finding, the subtle correlation between enemy patrol movements and the valley's shifting resonant frequencies. They saw a scientist. They were wrong. The arrival of Lieutenant Commander Marcus Thorne shattered the FOB's tense, weary equilibrium. He descended from a V-22 Osprey in a whirlwind of dust and self-importance, his crisp uniform a stark contrast to the sweat-stained, faded fatigues of the men who had been living in the maw for months. Thorne was a creature of doctrine and decorum, a man who believed that victory was a function of shouted orders and unwavering adherence to protocol. He saw the FOB not as a living organism adapting to a hostile environment, but as a sloppy, undisciplined mess that needed his brand of rigid authority. His first act was to call a full briefing in the Tactical Operations Center, the cramped, stuffy tent that served as the FOB's nerve center. The air was thick with the smell of hot electronics, stale coffee, and nervous sweat. Maps and satellite images were pinned to canvas walls, their corners curling in the dry heat. Thorne stood before them, a solid, immovable block of certainty in a world defined by doubt. His voice was a blunt instrument, hammering his points home with theatrical force. "This outpost," he began, his gaze sweeping across the tired faces before him, a gaze that managed to be both accusatory and dismissive, "is a disgrace. Your operational tempo is reactive. Your comms discipline is non-existent. You've been spooked by shadows, letting local atmospheric garbage dictate your patrols." He pointed a thick, manicured finger at a map showing recent enemy activity. "You call these coordinated attacks? I call them random pot shots from goat herders with rusty Kalashnikovs." It was then that his eyes landed on Aris. She was standing in the back, near her small workstation, her presence as quiet and unobtrusive as a shadow. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at a seismograph readout on her screen, her expression one of intense, clinical focus. The sight of a civilian, a woman in his toss, seemingly ignoring his grand pronouncements, was an intolerable affront to his sense of order. "And you," he barked, the sudden shift in focus causing everyone to turn. "What in the hell are you doing here? Who authorized a civilian scientist in my operational theater?" Petty Officer Elias Vance, the FOB's senior comms technician, and a man who had learned to appreciate the strange quiet of the valley, spoke up before Aris could. "She's with the survey team, sir. Geological survey, attached to SOCOMR&D. Thorne snorted, a harsh, ugly sound. "Geological survey? We're fighting a war, Petty Officer, not collecting souvenirs. What is she looking for? Pretty pebbles?" The men shifted uncomfortably. They might not have understood Aris, but she was part of their weary tribe. Thorne was an invader. Aris finally looked up. Her eyes, the color of storm clouds, met his. There was no fear in them, no deference. There was only a calm, unnerving stillness. "I'm studying the resonance, Commander," she said, her voice soft, but carrying a strange weight that cut through the humming electronics. "The what?" Thorne demanded, taking a step toward her. "The resonance," she repeated, her gaze dropping back to her screen. "The rock here, it sings. The enemy has learned to listen. You haven't." A vein pulsed in Thorne's temple. To be contradicted, to be spoken to in riddles by this academic mouse was more than his ego could bear. He saw her not as an asset, but as a symbol of the very indiscipline he was here to crush. "The rocks sing," he mimicked in a derisive, high-pitched voice. "Let me be clear, Doctor, or whatever you are. Your field trip is over. You will confine yourself to your quarters. You will not touch any operational equipment. You are a liability. When I'm done cleaning up this mess, I'm shipping you back to whatever university basement you crawled out of. Is that understood?" Aris didn't answer. She simply tapped a key on her laptop, saving a complex data string. Her silence was more infuriating to Thorne than any argument could have been. It was the silence of someone who knew a truth he couldn't even perceive, a silence that dismissed him utterly. He turned his back on her, a gesture of finality, and continued to lecture the assembled men on the proper way to wage war, his voice filling the tent with empty, confident noise. Vance caught Aris's eye for a brief moment. He saw no anger in her expression, no fear. He saw something that looked disturbingly like patience, like she was waiting for a storm she knew was coming, a storm that would prove her right and sweep away all the noise. The storm arrived 2 days later, not with the roar of thunder, but with a sudden, suffocating silence. It began at 0300 hours, when the night was at its blackest, and the cold of the high desert had seeped into the bones of every living thing. One moment, the talk was a low hum of activity, the quiet chatter of the watch team, the crackle of radio traffic from the SEAL element positioned on the valley's northern ridge, the steady thrum of the generators. The next, it was dead. Every screen went black. Every radio went silent. The generators sputtered and died, plunging the entire fob into an absolute disorienting darkness. It wasn't just a power failure. It was an erasure. Backup systems failed to engage. Battery-powered devices were inert. It was as if an invisible wave had washed over them, stripping away a century of technology and leaving them naked and blind in the hostile dark. Then came the sound. It wasn't an explosion. It was a low, pervasive hum that seemed to emanate from the rock itself, a deep, resonant frequency that vibrated in the chest and rattled the teeth. It was the song Eris had spoken of, but now it was a dirge. Emergency lights flickered on, casting the talk in a hellish red glow. Thorn was already on his feet, bellowing orders that no one could carry out. "Get the generators back online. Vance, what the hell is happening with comms? Get me a satellite link, now." Vance was wrestling with his equipment, his face pale in the crimson light. "It's not a jam, sir," he said, his voice tight with a professional's fear. "A jam is noise. This is an absence. It's a null field. Every frequency is being actively canceled out. The energy required, it's impossible." He looked toward Eris's station. She was standing perfectly still, her head tilted slightly, as if listening to a distant conversation. Outside, the attack began. It wasn't the chaotic spray of small arms fire they were used to. It was a methodical, terrifyingly precise assault. Mortar rounds, guided by targeting data that shouldn't have existed, began to walk their way across the compound, each explosion perfectly placed to maximize damage and confusion. Heavy machine gun fire erupted from the cliffsides, the muzzle flashes eerily silent, the sound of the impacts arriving a split second before the sound of the guns themselves, a trick of the valley's warped acoustics. The enemy knew exactly where they were. They, in turn, knew nothing. They were deaf, dumb, and blind. The most desperate silence was the one from the SEAL team on the ridge. Call sign Reaper 1, they were the FOB's eyes and ears, a 6-man reconnaissance team caught outside the wire. Their last transmission before the blackout had been a routine status check. Now, there was nothing. Thorn's blustering confidence began to crack, revealing the brittle fear beneath. His textbook solutions were useless. There was no air support to call, no artillery to coordinate. His authority was meaningless without the technology that projected it. He was just a man in a dark tent, shouting into a void. "Return fire!" he screamed. "Return fire at the muzzle flashes!" But the gunners were disoriented. The sound was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The flashes seemed to dance and shift, an optical illusion created by the superheated air and the strange lensing effect of the atmosphere. They were wasting ammunition, firing at ghosts, while the enemy's assault grew more accurate, more confident. In the midst of the chaos, Eris moved. She walked from her darkened workstation to the central command console, her movements calm and deliberate. The red emergency lighting carved sharp shadows on her face, making her look like a priestess at some grim altar. She placed her hands on the cold, dead surface of the main terminal. "Commander," she said, her voice cutting through his frantic shouting. It wasn't a request. It was a statement of fact. Your methods have failed. The environment is the battle space now, and you are out of your depth. Thorn spun on her, his face a mask of apoplectic rage. Get away from that console. I told you to. They are using the piezoelectric properties of the quartz-rich granite to power their EW suite, she continued, her voice level, clinical, as if she were delivering a lecture. They've created a cascading resonance loop, turning the entire valley into a massive self-sustaining jamming array. They aren't blocking our signals. They're using the valley's own resonant frequency to create a perfectly inverted waveform that cancels ours out. That's why the power is down. The EM pulse was a targeted side effect of the array coming online. It's elegant, it's brilliant, and it is killing us. Vance stared at her, his mouth agape. He understood just enough of what she was saying to be terrified. What she was describing wasn't in any textbook. It was theoretical physics, weaponized. I need access to the primary sensor array's emitter controls, Eris stated. And I need you, she looked directly at Vance, to bypass the command safeties and route all auxiliary power to the main capacitor bank. We have approximately 90 seconds before the next mortar volley finds this tent. Thorn lunged for her, his authority utterly stripped away, leaving only brute force. I am in command here. You will be arrested for insubordination. It was Vance who moved. He stepped between them, his hand on the butt of his sidearm. It wasn't a threat, but it was a choice, a definitive, career-ending choice. Sir, Vance said, his voice shaking but firm, we have nothing. We are going to die here. She is the only one with a different idea. We're listening to her now. The moment hung in the red-tinged air, thick and heavy. The sound of another mortar exploding just outside the tent, shaking the ground and showering the canvas with dirt, broke the spell. Thorn staggered back, his face a ruin of disbelief and impotence. His rank, his rules, his entire worldview had just been rendered obsolete by a quiet woman who listened to rocks. Authority didn't shift. It evaporated from Thorn and coalesced around Eris. She didn't seize it. It was simply drawn to her competence as the only viable force left in the universe. She sat down at the console, and Vance, without another word, moved to a breaker panel, prying it open with a multi-tool. The other operators in the TOS, who had been frozen in indecision, now moved with purpose, their eyes fixed on Eris, waiting for her commands. She had become their new center of gravity. Vance, she said, her fingers flying across the now glowing keyboard as auxiliary power began to bleed into the system. I need you to isolate a single frequency, 3.275 gigahertz. Do not broadcast. I need you to create a data packet, a simple, repeating binary sequence, prime numbers, and load it into the emitter buffer. Stand by for my mark. What are you doing? Vance asked, his hands working deftly to follow her instructions. The enemy's network is a closed loop, she explained, her eyes scanning lines of code that were scrolling across the screen, code she was writing herself. It's perfect, but that's its weakness. It has no error correction for external input because it doesn't expect any. It believes we are completely deaf. We're not going to try to shout over them. We're going to whisper a single, grammatically incorrect sentence into their ear. It will force their system to try and process a paradox. It will crash. Her screen lit up with a three-dimensional topographical map of the valley, glowing with complex overlays of thermal data, atmospheric pressure, and acoustic modeling. But a whisper isn't enough. We need a delivery system. The valley is a shield, but every shield has a crack. Her finger traced a line on the map, a path that snaked through the air itself. There, a thermal duct, a transient atmospheric anomaly caused by the wind shear over the western ridge interacting with the radiated heat from that specific granite face. It's a tube of stable air no more than 2 meters wide, lasting for less than a minute at a time. It's a fleeting 1 in a billion phenomenon. And it's our only way out. A new sound broke the rhythm of the battle, the desperate staccato burst of a radio coming back to life. It was garbled, shredded with static, but a voice cut through. "Eeper 1, under heavy, pinned down. Coordinates. We need backup, immediate." It was the SEAL team. They were still alive, but they were being systematically dismantled. The signal died as quickly as it had appeared, swallowed by the hum. Thorne looked up, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "They're alive. We have to—" His voice trailed off. He had no idea what to do. Eris didn't even look at him. Their broadcast was a fluke. It punched through on a random harmonic. It won't happen again, but it told me something. Her fingers danced, inputting new data. A small red circle appeared on the map, high on the cliffs overlooking the SEAL's last known position. "The enemy commander, he's there. That's the only location that has line of sight to his forces and to the emitter array that's generating the null field. He's the brain. We cut off the head of the snake." "We can't hit that," a Marine sergeant muttered, looking at the map. "That's over 4 kilometers away. Through that storm, in the dark, it's an impossible shot." Eris stood up. Impossible is a word used by people who have run out of ideas. She walked to a long, hard-sided case that had been leaning in her corner, unnoticed by everyone. She unclipped the latches and opened it. Lying in the custom-cut foam was not geological equipment. It was a rifle. But to call it a rifle was like calling a hurricane a stiff breeze. It was a heavily modified M2010 sniper system, but its barrel was longer. Its stock was a skeletal framework of carbon fiber and titanium, and its optic was a complex piece of machinery that seemed to merge a telescope with a supercomputer. She lifted the weapon from its case. It settled into her shoulder as if it were a part of her. The quiet academic was gone. In her place was something else, something cold and ancient and lethally precise. The ghost had finally shown herself. "Vance," she said, her voice now stripped of all inflection, becoming a tool of pure function. "The thermal duct will be perfectly aligned in 71 seconds. When I fire, you send the data packet. Not before, not after, exactly when I fire." She moved toward the entrance of the TOS, the rifle held at a low ready. "The sound of the shot will be the carrier wave." No one spoke. No one breathed. They watched her step out into the red-tinged darkness, into the chaos of the battle. She didn't run for cover. She walked with a calm, unhurried gait to a specific spot, a small mound of earth that gave her a clear view of the western ridge. She went to one knee, the rifle rising in a single, fluid motion. She wasn't looking at the ridge. She was looking at her optic, which was now slaved to the data from the TOSI's command console. The map, the wind shear data, the thermal imaging, the acoustic resonance model, it was all being fed directly into her scope. She wasn't aiming at a target. She was aiming at a single point in a 4-dimensional mathematical equation. The flight of the bullet was a miracle of physics, a testament to an impossible calculation. For the men in the toque, watching on the single reactivated screen that mirrored Eris's scope, time seemed to stretch and warp. The world was reduced to the numbers and vectors that scrolled across the display. They saw the variables she was processing in real time. Coriolis effect, spindrift, the Magnus effect of the crosswind, the subtle gravitational pull of the mountain itself. She adjusted for the temperature and density of the air, not just at her position, but along the entire 4,200-meter flight path, her model predicting changes with impossible accuracy. The thermal duct, her whisper-thin corridor through the chaos, was represented by a shimmering green tunnel on the screen. The target was an invisible point within that tunnel. She didn't aim at the enemy commander. She aimed at where he would be in the 5.8 seconds it would take for the 220-grain projectile to cross the valley. She breathed out, her heart rate slowing to a single, steady beat per second. The world fell away. There was no battle, no noise, no fear. There was only the calculation, the rifle, the valley, the wind, the target. They were all just variables in her problem. And she was the solution. A single word left her lips, a whisper carried over her comlink to Vance. Now. The rifle cracked. It was a dry, insignificant sound in the cacophony of the battle, a single sharp note swallowed by the bass hum of the valley. For a moment, nothing happened. And then everything happened. On the screen, they watched the tiny green dot representing the bullet travel an unerring path down the shimmering tunnel. It did not deviate. It did not waver. It was perfect. Simultaneously, Vance slammed his hand down on the enter key, releasing the data packet. A single, invisible pulse of structured nonsense, riding the sonic wake of Eris's bullet, shot across the valley and into the enemy's comms array. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The deep, oppressive hum that filled the valley stuttered, faltered, and then died with a screech of protesting electronics. The enemy's perfect, closed-loop network, force-fed a paradox it could not compute, crashed. Hard. Across the valley, the lights on the enemy's equipment flickered and went dark. The methodical, accurate mortar and machine gun fire ceased as if a switch had been thrown. The null field collapsed. Suddenly, the talk was flooded with light and sound. The main power roared back to life. Every screen flickered on, displaying a chaotic cascade of status updates, and every radio channel exploded with noise at once. Eaper 1 is Winchester on ammo, but we are holding. Enemy is breaking. I repeat, enemy forces are in a full, disorganized retreat. What the hell just happened? The SEAL team leader's voice was a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and utter disbelief. A profound silence fell inside the talk, a silence far deeper than the one the enemy had imposed. It was the silence of awe. The operators and soldiers stared at the main screen, which now showed a standard satellite view of the valley. The enemy, who had been prosecuting a perfect siege moments before, were now just panicked men, fleeing into the darkness, their technological advantage erased in a single surgical strike. Thorne stood frozen, his face slack, his mind unable to process the sequence of events. He had seen the impossible made real. He had witnessed a single soldier, a woman he had dismissed as a rock sniffer, dismantle an entire enemy operation with one bullet and a piece of code. He saw the looks on the faces of his men as they turned from the screens to look at the tent flap where Eris had disappeared. They weren't looking at him anymore. They would never look at him with the same deference again. He had been rendered irrelevant. Eris walked back into the talk. She placed the rifle back in its case, her movements as calm and precise as ever. She showed no sign of triumph, no elation. She looked like a technician who had just completed a complex but routine diagnostic. She went back to her workstation, sat down, and began running a post-action analysis, her fingers once again flying across the keyboard. The battle was over, but for her, the data was still fresh, and there were lessons to be learned, models to be refined. It was into this stunned quiet that a new voice spoke, cutting through the static on a channel no one had been monitoring. It was a command channel, encrypted with protocols that made it accessible only to the highest echelons of strategic command. The voice was calm, aged, and carried the unmistakable weight of absolute authority. "FOB Vigilance, this is Admiral Kincaid, SOCOM Command. Come in, Vigilance." Vance, shaking himself out of his stupor, scrambled to respond. "Admiral, this is Petty Officer Vance at FOB Vigilance. We read you, sir. We had a comms blackout." "I'm aware of your situation, son," the voice replied, a dry edge to it. "We saw the whole thing on the satellite feed. A rather elegant bit of problem solving. Put your station commander on." Vance looked at Thorne. The lieutenant commander seemed to shrink before their eyes. He stumbled forward and took the headset, his hand trembling slightly. "Sir, Lieutenant Commander Thorne here. We repelled the attack, sir." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. The silence was more damning than any reprimand. "No, Commander, you did not," the Admiral said finally, his voice cold as interstellar space. "You were comprehensively defeated. You were saved. Now I have one question for you, Thorne. What is Spectre's status?" Thorne's face went blank. "Spectre, sir? I don't understand. There's no asset by that name on my roster. There's no one here by that name." Another pause, this one filled with a palpable sense of disappointment. "I see," Kincaid said. It was Eris who stood up and walked over to the comm station. She gently took the headset from Thorne's unresisting hand. He stared at her, his eyes wide with a dawning, horrified comprehension. She keyed the microphone. "Spectre is on station, Admiral," she reported, her voice calm and clear. "The primary threat has been neutralized. The secondary asset is secure. The environment has been stabilized." The shock in the tosse was a physical force. The men stared at the quiet geologist, the woman they had ignored and pitied, and tried to reconcile her with the legendary, almost mythical call sign she had just claimed. Spectre. Not a person, but a phenomenon. A ghost operator whispered about in briefing rooms and deployed to solve problems deemed impossible. An asset so secret that most high-ranking officers believed she was a myth. A boogeyman used to scare programmers at DARPA. "Excellent work, Spectre," the Admiral's voice replied, now tinged with warmth and familiarity. "Your analysis of the enemy's capabilities was, as usual, flawless. You were right. A conventional force would have been annihilated." "They were clever, Admiral," Eris stated. "They weaponized the geology. It was a beautiful piece of theoretical work. They just didn't account for the fact that I loved the rocks more than they did." "Commander Thorne," Kincaid's voice went flat and hard again, "you are to consider yourself relieved of command, effective immediately. A full inquiry will be conducted into your performance, your disregard for attached specialist assets, and your utter failure to adapt to the operational environment. You will pack your personal effects and await transport. Is that clear?" "Yes, Admiral," Thorne whispered, the words barely audible. His face had crumpled, his arrogance and certainty burned away, leaving behind only the ash of his career. He looked at Eris, at Spectre, and for the first time he saw her. He saw the crushing weight of her competence, the terrifying depth of her knowledge. He hadn't been in command for a single moment since he'd stepped off that helicopter. He had just been a loud, ignorant tourist in her world. Kincaid's final words were for her. "Your transport will be there at 0600. Good work, Aris." "Acknowledged, Admiral," she said, and then she switched off the channel. The aftermath was quieter than the battle itself. Thorne was escorted to his quarters by two silent Marines, a commander no longer in command, a ghost of a different sort. The chain of command reverted to the FOB's original, weary captain, who now looked at Eris with a reverence usually reserved for deities. The work of the base resumed, but the atmosphere had been fundamentally altered. The men moved with a new purpose. Their conversations were hushed. They were all acutely aware that they had been standing on the edge of an abyss, and a woman who understood the secrets of stone had pulled them back. Later, as the first hints of dawn painted the bruised sky, Vance approached her. He found her where she always was, by her table, cleaning the impossible rifle with meticulous care. He didn't say thank you. The words felt too small, too clumsy for what she had done. Instead, he held out a piece of the red granite he had picked up outside the tent. It was sharp-edged and cool in his hand. "The rock," he said, his voice quiet. "What was it telling you?" Eris paused her work. She took the piece of granite from him, turning it over in her fingers. Her touch was gentle, respectful. "It was telling me its age," she said. "Its composition, its density. It was telling me how it would behave under pressure, how it would fracture, how it would conduct heat, and how it would vibrate. It was telling me a story. The enemy read the first chapter and thought they knew the ending. I just read it more carefully." She handed the rock back to him. "Everything has a story, petty officer. Every system has a language. You just have to be willing to learn it. Your work with signal propagation, it's the same thing. You listen to the silence between the words." Vance looked down at the rock in his hand, then back at her. He finally understood. She wasn't a geologist. She wasn't even a sniper. She was a translator, a woman who could read the source code of the physical world. And in a war that was increasingly about information, she was the ultimate weapon. At 0600, as predicted, a single unmarked black helicopter descended into the valley. It was a sleek, silent machine that seemed to absorb the morning light. It touched down just long enough for Eris to board, carrying only her rifle case and a small pack. She didn't look back. She didn't wave goodbye. She had arrived as a mystery, and she left as a legend, her purpose fulfilled. The men of FOB Vigilance watched her go. They would tell the story for the rest of their lives, the story of the quiet woman who studied rocks while a storm gathered around them. They would speak of the night the valley sang a song of death, and how she answered with a single, perfect note of her own. She was a ghost, a whisper, a name on a secret file. She was Spectre, and she had taught them that the most dangerous weapon in any war is not the one that makes the most noise, but the one that understands the silence, the one that knows the true nature of the ground beneath your feet. For in a world of arrogant authority and rigid doctrine, true power belongs to those who listen.